Welcome to the Architecture of Empire from about 2000 to 330 before the Common Era. Today we'll be talking about how art and architecture can serve as a backbone for politics, religion, and all other mechanisms of rule in the ancient world. So what you see here is the city of Persepolis, and Persepolis was the ceremonial capital of the Achaemenid Persian Empire from about 550 to 330. It was founded by Darius the Great, who some of you may know as the father of Xerxes, who fought the Spartans at the Battle of Thermopylae. So Persepolis, city of the Persians, was used normally as a ceremonial site for the spring equinox celebration. But if we take a look at the elements of it, we can see some of the ways that the power of the Persian Empire is being explained to the people who would be coming to this site. First of all, it's elevated. We're up on a terrace about 40 feet high off the ground. And you can see from the outlines here that there are many large halls, pillars, staircases, and all kinds of ceremonial entryways into these different areas. So if we think about the layout and the floor plan of these ancient cities, we'll start to develop a way that we're looking at the kings or the emperors as being absolutely central to life in this empire. So through the building of cities, the building of temples, the building of palaces, of monuments, and even markers along the road, we see an expression of power from these rulers. So the empires that we'll be talking about today, I just want to kind of give you a brief overview. We've got the Egyptians over here, which you can see in this period are actually also taking over all of this area of Israel, Palestine, Syria, etc. And the part of the Egyptian Empire that we'll be looking at today is the 11th and the 12th dynasties from about 2040 to 1782 before the Common Era, in which period the pharaoh was the absolute heart and soul of the empire. This is a divine ruler who is an absolutist, right? All power comes through the pharaoh. And this continues until invasions by Alexander the Great in the 330s before the Common Era. We also have the Hittite Empire, which occupies the area of modern Turkey and the Anatolian Peninsula here. Most important today because it's sort of holding this place until the breakup during the late Bronze Age collapse, which we still don't really know what caused that. We've got the Assyrians here who were ruling from about 2500 to 609. And various Persian dynasties will take over here. We've got the Babylonians, who we already looked at last week in the Tigris and Euphrates river valleys. They replaced the Akkadians that had been before them. And probably our most famous Babylonian emperor king is Hammurabi, who ruled from 1792 to 1750, and who we'll meet in a moment. So this is the region of the world that we're in. The Persian Empire that I mentioned that founded Persepolis, the Achaemenid Empire, actually expands and absorbs these other empires. So by the time we get to 500 before the Common Era, around the time that Persepolis is founded and established, the Achaemenid Empire is at its absolute height. And so this is important because what it does is it brings together all of these different artistic styles from different people speaking different languages, worshiping different religions, and creates this really interesting sort of cross-cultural hybrid as the empire itself is encapsulating and encompassing many, many different people. I should point out that I'm using the term empire to refer to a sovereign state that has many other states or polities underneath it. So whereas a king with his kingdom would be one discrete unity, an empire can be comprised of many different kingdoms or even miniature empires underneath that. So what this does is it brings together and causes clashes between different peoples and different styles of art and life and culture. So we'll start here in the Babylonian Empire with the Stele of Hammurabi. You're probably familiar with the Law Code of Hammurabi. This is something that has been preserved in a lot of clay tablets that exist. But what's important here is that this is the law inscribed on a public monument. So we remember that the stele is a sort of giant stone slab that's usually erected in the ground. And this is made of basalt, so that dark black volcanic stone. And you can see that it has been polished beautifully to a sheen here. At the top, we have a scene of Hammurabi himself meeting the sun god Shamash. And Shamash is handing over insignia to Hammurabi. And the insignia include this sort of stake or rod and either a ring or a piece of string in various interpretations, but these are the materials of kingship, right? So he's investing Hammurabi with the right to rule. Because they're both in the same register right at the top here, and because they're both the same size, so we do not have hierarchy of scale here, we can see that Hammurabi is affiliating himself with the sun god Shamash. This tells us that his authority is legitimated by the gods themselves. All of the cuneiform that is written underneath is carved directly into the basalt and tells us a lot of what we need to know about how justice was administered in the Babylonian Empire. Some of the elements of this are that people should take accountability when they have wronged someone else in the community, that violence should be limited. And it tells us also about the way that society is organized, because we can see certain classes getting certain privileges and certain classes not. So we have a hierarchy that we're aware of through the law code here. And the code that we often think about today is an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. But I do want to point out that that doesn't condone violence, that actually limits violence, right? So an eye for an eye, but only an eye, right? So you can't kill somebody for having plucked out your eye. So I just want to kind of give that framework. So we're really dealing with a place where it's very important to the ruler, to Hammurabi, that things are fair, that things are just, and that people have recourse. We also see a lot of low reliefs carved into stone. And this is a continuation of what we have already seen last week. But in this case, these carvings serve to tell stories about rulers and about empires. So these two are taken from the Northwest Palace, which was the old capital for the Assyrian Empire. Please note that these are both in the British Museum at the moment. We also have some in the Brooklyn Museum. Some of you may have seen. So after around 1200, when we have this late Bronze Age collapse, the Assyrians kind of have to look to the past in a new way to reform their empire. And so one of the things that the probably most prominent Assyrian emperor, Ashurnasirpal II, who rules in the 9th century before the Common Era, is that he relocates the capital to Nimrud, and he builds what we call the Northwest Palace, this huge complex that is designed to underscore and to communicate the power of the Assyrians in the wake of this late Bronze Age collapse. They come out strong, and they're rebuilding purposefully and coherently. So when we talk about the stories that are being told, these narrative cycles in these low reliefs, what we're really talking about is a pictorial program. It's not happenstance what gets carved here. It is purposeful, it is deliberate, and it should be viewed as a whole, so that everything in the Northwest Palace works together to create this particular image of Ashurnasirpal. He built a long wall all the way around the city. The Northwest Palace itself, like Persepolis, is on raised ground. We've got gates, we've got temples, we've got a canal system. This is a very sophisticated city, which in and of itself shows that Ashurnasirpal is a good ruler, that he provides continuity and security for his peoples, and that he has the money to build something like this. So these commissioned works of art are intended to glorify the power of not only the king, but the king as a leader of a victorious army, as a generous person who uses his wealth, his largesse, to enhance the lives of his people, and as someone who is associated with the divine and is backed by supreme supernatural forces. So here on the left, we have some archers, and we can see the archers running in battle. They are obviously going to be victorious in this particular battle. And these are carved out of gypsum, which is a kind of chalky mineral substance which hardens as it's exposed to air. These panels are typically orthostats or orthostates, which means that they're squared off panels or rectangular panels that are taller than they are thick, and that they're used to kind of bolster walls. So in the case of the Northwest Palace, these are over the brick walls that are behind them. And so they serve as decorative panels that can tell longer stories that stretch out over the course of a whole room, but they're also supporting the walls. Sorry. And then here we have the emperor himself meeting somebody who did a good job in a battle. And we can see also this individual carrying the parasol and a divine figure up in the sky here. This is another orthostat at the Brooklyn Museum. And we can see the king here and a divine being, a winged spirit following him with a little pot of water that he's using to kind of do these rituals, little holy water. But I wanted you to focus in on here. This isn't from this particular same image, but it's from another set. You can actually see the cuneiform that is etched all over this whole band of writing in these reliefs. We also have Lamassu, and these are winged hybrid creatures that served as guardians of the doorways in the Assyrian palaces. So these two are actually at the Metropolitan, and they have human heads, and just note this gorgeous detail in the beard and the hair. They're wearing the specific hat that indicates divinity. They have the wings of an eagle and the body either of a lion as on the left or as a bull on the right. And what's interesting about these is that these animals are actually carved with 5 legs, so that when you're approaching from the front, they look like they're standing guard. But when you look at them from the side, you can see that the legs are in motion as though they're progressing forward. And these are carved out of alabaster. So just put yourself in the position of somebody who's approaching one of the Assyrian emperors. And the first thing that you do is you go through this gateway with these enormous, larger than life creatures who are staring you down, who have these big, robust bodies, who exude this sort of mystical power. So that's going to set your mind as you're approaching into the space. After the first quarter of the 7th century before the Common Era, so around 625, the Babylonians rose up against the Assyrians and overthrew them, shifting the power base back to the city of Babylon itself. And that is where the Ishtar Gate comes from. So in the same way that we saw with Ashurnasirpal, our Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar II is consciously and deliberately rebuilding his capital city. And again, this is the use of art and architecture in the service of power and empire. So Nebuchadnezzar II actually is responsible for commissioning this Ishtar Gate. He builds a 40-foot moat around the city, double walls for defensiveness, and a special ziggurat, a special tiered pyramid temple to Marduk, who is the Babylonian patron god. And as well, he built fortified gates, 8 gates around the city, and this is one of them. This was the ceremonial entrance to the city, so it's even grander than the other gates, right? It's meant to impart this sort of sense of awe upon somebody coming to the city of Babylon. It's very tall and very dominant and impressive. So when it was discovered in the 1800s, I believe, 1904, sorry, it was smuggled out of Iraq, out of modern day Iraq, into Berlin, to the point where they were consciously smuggling the pieces out. They had dismantled it, numbered it, and hid the pieces in various other containers to ship it. So it didn't look like this patrimony of Iraq is leaving the country. That creates some issues because this is still in Berlin today. So the walls of this gate are 23 feet thick, and it's made of glazed bricks that are meant to imitate lapis lazuli. And this, as you remember, is this very, very rare ultramarine blue, which is so, so precious, coming from Afghanistan, Iran, from that crushed up crystal mineral. So this is meant to evoke the most wild wealth, right? Like the idea that somebody could pay for an outside gate to be emblazoned with lapis lazuli would really communicate this tremendous, tremendous wealth. All along, there are 125 life-sized or life-size-ish animals, including lions, bulls, and even dragons. And this gate was specially used on a festival dedicated to Marduk, in which lasted something like 12 days. So the issue that this is not currently in Iraq raises some questions that I want to address the last week of the semester in your final project. And namely, who should have this? Should this belong to Iraq? Should it go back and be threatened to potentially be destroyed in an airstrike in acts of war, etc.? Or should it remain smuggled, stolen, really, in a place where it's safe? So just kind of think about that, because Iraq is aggressively trying to get this Ishtar Gate back to their museum system. But it's something that needs to be weighed out, right, for the preserving and protection of such art objects. Here are a couple of the animals, and you can see just this fearsome lion and what we call the mashusu, which is this angry snake, ferocious snake. And this horned head looks like it belongs to a snake's body, but we've got lion's feet in the front and birds of prey, claws, talons here in the back. And again, both of these set against this pseudo lapis lazuli background. So as you're walking along, and these are life size, I know that this serpent hybrid is imaginary, but imagine walking alongside and sort of making eye contact with this lion, just reminding you of what you're about to see, this hugely protected and powerful ruler that has these animals kind of at his whim, at his beck and call. So here's an imagination of what this gate would have looked like in situ. So we've got this long colonnaded area walking up to the gate, which is located here. So as you're entering the city, you're already getting primed to have a certain interpretation of not only the ruler, but of the city that he built in his own image, really. So the whole time you're walking up and approaching along this long colonnaded pathway, this causeway, really, you're starting to already absorb the communicated message of the Babylonian authority. On the orthostat at Persepolis, we're back here in Persepolis, we can see a very on the nose idea of representing one's sort of subordination or obedience to, in this case, the Achaemenid emperors. So these are narrative reliefs that are actually telling stories that are happening, you know, in an order, in a procession. And what we see here on the staircase that leads up to the Apadana, which is the audience hall in which the Persian king would sit, is all of the subordinate governors and all of the people who work on a local level for the emperor are bringing their tribute to him. So they're processing with their gifts and reminding him that they are loyal to him. So this is an interesting piece of art here, because this is actually what would be happening during particular festival moments when these tributes are actually coming in. So these would have been painted and they are life size. So this kind of serves as like a meta procession as the actual real people are processing in and seeing their likenesses on the walls of the staircase that they're walking up. And so I want to point out too that their posture with both feet on the same plane evokes older Babylonian and Egyptian styles. So we call this archaizing. And what this does is it connects through sort of the use or the appropriation of old artistic motifs. It connects the new ruler with the old, establishing the sense of continuity and establishing the sense of authority, right? They are justified rulers because they are like these ancient idealized rulers that we're looking back to. So by associating themselves with ancient Mesopotamia, with Egypt, the Persian rulers are harnessing the automatic obedience to those rules. This whole city actually was looted when Alexander the Great burst in, and the story is that he was very drunk when he destroyed it. Here we can see two more of the Lamassus figures guarding this entryway. And we also see a lot of very high art, right? Architectural elements here. It draws the eye upwards towards the heavens, towards the gods. These long linear things would be seen from far away, right? These columns with their capitals on top. And so again, this is something else that sort of breaks the continuity of the landscape and shows the power from afar. Similarly, hypostyle halls also give us an opportunity to tell stories on the circular surfaces or the rounded surfaces of the columns themselves. So here we have the hypostyle hall, and hypostyle just refers to a series of columns that essentially hold up the roof. It really means under the columns. And so these serve as support, but also as another face, another surface to be decorated with carving, with relief, with painting, etc. So here at Luxor, what used to be known as the capital of Thebes in Egypt, and then on the right, the Egyptian temple at Dendera. And you can see, even though these are a millennium apart, we're still using the same kinds of styles, these thick, round, weighty, very imposing columns that are carved and that tell stories or reinforce certain iconographies for the people who are visiting there. And again, remember, you'd be walking through this, and so it would surround you and you would really get a sense of just how impressive this monumental building is. At the Dendera temple on the right, you can see actually that there's also quite a substantial amount of painting on the roof, and that the capitals here have the faces carved into them. To continue with this theme of verticality, we have 3 obelisks here. An obelisk, etymologically linked to the Greek word for nail, is a 4-sided monolith, right? So this is specifically carved from one huge piece of rock, and they taper like a needle at the top, which is why we call them Cleopatra's needles. It has nothing to do with Cleopatra. She was already like 1,000 years away from the construction of these needles. But what's interesting, or not interesting, I should say, what's noteworthy about these is that none of them are where they came from, right? So we've got a Luxor obelisk in Paris at the Place de la Concorde, right in the center of the city. And you can tell from its name that this came from the temple at Luxor that we just looked at Thebes. This was in a temple dedicated to Ramses II, and then was actually given to Paris as a gift, potentially in 1833. It's 75 feet high. And we have to wonder, this is outside. This is not necessarily being preserved from the elements. Is that a problem? On the right, we've got Cleopatra's Needle in London. And I know it's a little bit of a grainy photo, but you can see it's more worn away than the one in Paris. And the base actually was hit by a bomb in World War II. So it has been damaged, but this was gifted by the Pasha of Egypt in 1819. Originally came from a city called Heliopolis. And then in the center, some of you have probably visited Cleopatra's Needle in the city in Central Park. And this is right by the Met, actually, also gifted by the Pasha of Egypt in 1877. So this raises another moral issue, right? These items on display here being taken out of their original context, many of which do not really exist in a safe way anymore for these places to be, for these needles to be, or these obelisks to be safely preserved. So it does raise this ethical dilemma. The hieroglyphs on the side of the various obelisks talk about the reigns of different individuals. For example, Ramses II, and who describes various emperors as the chosen one of Amun-Ra, the lord of the 2 lands of Upper and Lower Egypt, the glorification of Osiris. So we're seeing all of this very kind of, not pompous, but like very self-aggrandizing information that's used with the hieroglyphics here. We also have the Temple of Deir el-Bahari, or Bari, and this is in Egypt. And this is quite a different way of expressing power from the former funerary locations, which were the temples, like the pyramids at Giza, for example, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. So instead of building something out of the ground with constructed material, mortuary temples like Deir el-Bahari are actually carved directly from the stone itself. And these are limestone cliffs that are sort of gouged out and shaped into these huge complexes. So to use this idea of archaizing again, although this is a different way to bury the dead, to put the tombs into the ground rather than inside the pyramid, to dig directly out of the rock rather than to construct with various pieces of stone. In that sense, yes, this is different. The new kingdom is doing something very different than the old kingdom that had preceded it so many years before. But this is constructed on the same side of the Nile, on the western side of the Nile, as the old kingdom necropolis is. And a necropolis is a city of the dead where all of these tombs are collected. So on the one hand, we see something new and different, but on the other hand, we see a hearkening back to this ancient tradition of burying on the west side of the Nile. So again, borrowing from and connecting to the old kingdom in order to sort of bolster the new kingdom's authority. And so this was originally built by Mentuhotep, who was the first to unify Upper and Lower Egypt, but this was added on by various other rulers, Amenhotep, and especially Hatshepsut, who was the second female pharaoh of all time. So the causeway that you see these people on leads you to this ramp upwards, and then you enter the complex, and there are various temples. And again, you can see the hypostyle here, the columns holding up the roof, and that the architecture here itself is presenting this image of sort of being one with the land, being organic, of being inextricable from the land, but also these big broad plazas, again, give this sense of enormity of scope and wealth and timelessness. In Egypt, also the great temple dedicated to Ramses II, who was from the 13th century before the Common Era, the husband of Nefertiti. He also, like the other emperors that we saw before, had a huge purposeful building campaign in which he built multiple temples, especially this great one dedicated to himself, carved literally out of the sandstone. So this is now a UNESCO protected site. And incidentally, in the 60s, in order to create Lake Nasser in Egypt, with the help of the Aswan Dam, they actually had to move the entire site. So here on the right, you can see dismantling piece by piece how this sort of slots in here to create this flawless surface. Such a feat, can't even imagine. But here we see one of the statues of Ramses is actually destroyed by an earthquake. And so when they reconstructed it, they left it as it was when they were planning to move it. So this is sort of a replica of the ancient damage. So these 4 images are Ramses himself, and in each he's wearing the double crown. If you guys remember from the Narmer palette, the crown of Lower Egypt and the crown of Upper Egypt. So now we have these 2 united, and Ramses here is obviously, we're dealing with the hierarchy of scale. He is enormous. And so as you're walking in, there's nothing else to feel except tiny and diminutive and powerless in the face of these huge statues. So the statues in the front had actually sort of faded from use, faded from attention for a long time. By the 6th century before the Common Era, the sand had blown up all the way to the knees. So this was already almost buried. And then it was rediscovered in 1813. And since then, ultimately was protected as a UNESCO site. The statues are 66 feet tall, enormous. And what these show us is a depiction of Ramses as divine, right? So he's not just an earthly ruler, but he is far more than that. He is somebody to be venerated and worshiped himself. So reinforcing this idea of the pharaoh as this absolute, almost identifiable with Egypt itself. The art and architecture of empire also extends to statues, right? And so on the left, we have the statue of Akhenaten, and he was the first to establish a monotheistic religion to replace the Egyptian polytheism. And so he's very important in the history of Egypt, but we have no mummy from him. So all we have is statuary. And so Yale Medical School has been focusing on improving, let's say, the observational skills of its doctors in training. And one of the professors there assigned his students to look at this statue of Akhenaten and to say, what kinds of gene defects can we understand from the way that he is consistently depicted? He always has a sort of elongated egg-shaped head, a narrow waist, wide hips, and a belly that protrudes as though pregnant. So his theory that he still wants tested by Egyptologists, people who study ancient Egypt, is that there is a gene defect that regulates the amount of estrogen that is produced in his body, and that he had a cranial issue when he was younger and it fused too quickly. So they're going to test his mummies, or his relatives' mummies, the 5 known to be in his family line, to see if we can learn more about that. But nevertheless, this is a hugely imposing statue. It's enormous, right? It's called a colossal statue. It's very, very big and very domineering. So you're always going to be looking up at it, right? So there's this hierarchy of point of view happening where the pharaoh is not even making eye contact with you, but you're gazing upwards, right? As though at his feet, as though kneeling. And then this very strong pose here with his arms crossed. And all around we can see decorative elements here communicating wealth, beauty, whatever his textiles are indicating here. And then on the right here, we have a particular statue from the Kush Empire, which is in modern day Sudan. And the Kush actually rose up and seized first Upper Egypt, which is in the south, and then Lower Egypt, which is in the north in the 8th century. And what they brought to it was a completely new way of blending traditionally Kush artistic styles with ancient Egyptian. So whereas the Egyptians kind of looked at others as not worthy of borrowing from, for example, their relationship with the Nubians nearby, but the Kush Empire actually took a lot from Egypt and therefore aligned themselves with this very, very long-lasting dynasty. So again, this archaism or archaizing that is intended to merge with a pre-existing unchallenged rule. And then perhaps the most famous example of how pharaohs and other rulers made sure that they were respected even in death is the discovery of King Tut's tomb in 1922 by Howard Carter. So Tut's tomb had actually been underneath the tomb of another pharaoh, and that tomb had been robbed, grave robbed. But it seems like nobody ever knew that Tutankhamun was actually enshrined underneath that other tomb. And so in 1922, Carter, for the first time in more than 3,000 years, was able to break this seal on Tut's tomb, which you see here, this knotted work that has never been opened for something like 3,200 years. And inside, of course, he found King Tut's very famous, well-known tomb, all three tombs in there, or all three sarcophaguses with the tomb inside and his death mask. So this was a tremendously valuable find, of course, but in terms of the archaeology of empire, the architecture of empire, just the amount of gold and lapis lazuli and the treasures that were found in the antechamber before entering into his tomb. I mean, all of this speaks to not only profound wealth in life and in death, but this sort of sense of continuation of power and passage into divinity itself in the afterlife. Okay, so here are the vocabulary terms that I would like you to know for this week. Good luck on your quiz. Thank you.